Well, good afternoon. All right, so it's Monday. We're at the shop working on a rather. This is a good relic here. She's an oldie but survivor. This here is a '97 Lexus ES 300, which has pretty much a really. It would have been in its day the luxury line of the Toyota Camry, which it would have been in its day. It would have. It was a nice vehicle, sunroof, all the fancy stuff. These are kind of like pretty tough. 414,000 miles, I think this thing's got on it right now. Or it might be more than that. I can't remember. I looked at the odometer Friday. It was like 400 and something thousand miles. I put a timing belt and water pump on it at, it had a 369 on it. If I remember telling them, I believe it had 70,000 miles. It was more like 430,000, I remember. So it's getting due for its timing belt and water pump again. However, what we've run into today was it was brought to me because it would not start. He suspected something fuel. He said, I got a bad fuel pump because it would just turn over. It would try to crank, but it would just turn over. Well, once I got in it, I realized it had spark and there was fuel. I just said, this thing's flooded. So I held it wide open like you do an old carbureted motor, and I just turned it over several rounds, and it coughed and it came to life, and it spit old black smoke out because of the unburnt fuel just coming out the exhaust until it ran fine after that. And it's started ever since. But what it is people have gotten used to starting vehicles without having to hit the throttle, which is okay because fuel injection working properly would provide that opportunity because you'll have an idle control valve, proper fuel and air mixture because of the sensors telling the computer what to put the fuel mixture at. You don't have to do all that. It would do that for you. Well, what happened is it didn't start, and so the customer probably just kept starting it, not hitting the throttle till it just flooded itself more because the idle valve. So get into my whole point is the idle valve had malfunctioned, and these use a thermatically controlled idle valve as much, and they also use an air bleed as well. But the thermatically controlled idle valve is heated by two water lines that come up from the engine right here off of the engine's coolant, and so that's how they know to idle up and then idle down. The heated water will go through here and heat a thermatically controlled spring, which can be kind of manipulated by a magnetic coil right here. If you take this out, there's a couple of permanent or some magnets right here, and this little signal goes here and can manipulate it, give it a little up and down if it needs it. But it's on a little pivot that moves inside of there, and it's real close quarters because it has to be able to seal vacuum off to control idle properly. So it doesn't take much at all for that spring, that little pivot to get jammed. The spring that rolls it accordingly. Okay, so what I usually find is we'll have a situation where dirt gets in this hole because this is the hole that the air is drawn into for the idle control purposes by this thermatically controlled idle circuit. So dirt gets in there. Dirt gets in there for a couple different ways. Lack of maintenance on the air filter. Here's a good example. Dirt's in here. The air filter should catch all those big particles. Of course, you really shouldn't see all that dirt in there. I looked and made sure the inner fender was in, but there's probably somehow or another there's dirt getting in there. Maybe lives on a real dirty, like sandy road. I don't know. But what people don't realize is they'll get a K&N filter, and they'll love these things because it says it gives you more fuel mileage. So the first thing they'll do is they'll put this in here, and it comes pre-oiled from the factory, and they just leave it in there because they said it's good for the life of the vehicle. And they don't read the stuff where you're supposed to wash this thing and oil it because the oil, these things are so porous. The foam is so porous that it allows more air to go through, which is nice if you're in a race condition. But in daily driving, you're really not going to notice much of a power increase and probably not much of a fuel mileage. You'll actually notice a problem like this. There's a couple things that took place. This thing was never maintained. It was never washed. It was never re-oiled. So sand and dirt and particles got to go through. And what happened is that's what got all jammed into the idle valve. But not only is it doing that, you're getting sand and particles all on your elements on your air intake or your airflow meter, or mass airflow meter. Also air intake temperature sensor as well. Most of the time they incorporate the two because they rely on a sensor. A mass airflow sensor works by a heated transistor, they'll have a heater on one end and then they'll have another like a diode or a resistor behind it. And the air that goes by it cools off what's heated up, and that cooling changes the value of the component, whether it be some of them are diodes, some resistors, just different designs. And so anyhow, long story short, they can get air temperature reading off of that as well. So air got all this dirt, and you can see it in the air filter. You know, I showed you a second ago all the stuff where sediment had pretty much, you know, you can see that all that went in there. It's not good on the rings on the motor either. Sand and all that kind of eats out the rings. So my just suggestion in this situation is, what I'm going to do is, I've got to tune it up anyhow. I'm going to put plugs in it because I'm going to pull the throttle body off, and I'm going to pull that thermatically controlled idle valve apart. I'm going to clean it really well. I'm going to replace the K&N filter with a regular paper element that can be just changed out whenever it's time to be changed, because most people that service vehicles, that change oil at oil change shops, would look, when they see a K&N filter, they just put the air box lid right back on it. They don't mess with it, because apparently that's customer options right there. They don't. So if they see a normal air filter element, they'll take it out, look at it, and change it if it needs it. So I'm going to put a regular one back in place, clean all this out, tune it up, and I'll do some, like, when I get the throttle body torn apart, I'll show you on it. But that right there was what caused the vehicle not to turn. When it was just turning over, the idle valve was stuck, because these little fine granulars of sand has probably worked through that air filter and got jammed. Because when you're sitting there idling and cranking it up, all the air is traveling through this. You don't really have much going through the actual butterfly. There is a small, teeny-weeny baseline opening, but most of it's going right. When you hear, if you take this air box lid off and you hear it's because it's going all through that hole right there. So anything that gets through here goes through that little tiny opening and through the automatically controlled thingy-majingy. When I show you a video of what it looks like, you'll see why. All right, here, I'll holler back here in a little bit. Okay, so what I've done a little bit here. I went ahead and removed the throttle body before I tried to pull the intake. Reason being is because if you're working on this model car, this model kind of carries all the way from, like, I think 93 up to, I don't know, probably like 99, 2000. So real similar. By removing the throttle body, you can really get to these bolts that hold this tube on that would have held this EGR valve on right here. If you try to do it otherwise, you're going to be dropping stuff. So I'd pull the throttle body off first. I just leave these lines all hooked up nice and fancy. Just unplug it. Mark some stuff with some white out, like right there on the, you know, where you got two lines that go right beside each other. You can put a dot on one and then a dot on your hose so that you know that, you know, which one goes where, you know. That's what I've done there. So helps. Same vacuum port. Probably won't matter if you switch it around, but if you want to be all nice and neat, that's kind of how I do it. Anyhow, all right, I'll be back in a little bit. All right, so here we are with the throttle body. That I've got everything back together, pretty much. I've already put the spark plugs and the wires and all that stuff on it. And so, as I suspected, I removed the little pedal control off of the piece. It's magnetic. It'll pick up. It actually has like a magnetic type. You see that? So it controls this. This thing can turn. However, it's sticking. I have to kind of work to move it. It should move very freely. From one side to the other, it should move very freely. And so what I'll do is put it in the clamp, and I don't really want to take this apart right here to get directly to it, because there's a seal that seals water off for these lines that go up through here. So if I can blow in this line here, blow in this hole where it comes out to the other side right here, then I may be able to get the dirt or whatever you want to call it in there out and clean it. This right here, if you take this off, you get to that spring that's thermatically controlled. If you take that out, you'll see a winding of like a coil, and it reacts to the heat that the water puts on it when the engine warms up, which then moves the little panel that's inside of here. It's like a little piece that kind of is shaped convex, and it kind of like goes like that. Okay, I'll get her clamped up and we'll clean out and see what happens. Well, what we're doing is I sprayed some PB Blaster in there. This is what I used. I really don't like to use brake cleaner, because this metal has somewhat of a coating on it, and what'll happen is you'll spray that in there and it'll mess the coating up on the throttle body. And I'll even open this throttle up and maybe clean it some and just give it a little scrub out. That's something you can do while you got the throttle body off. It's not that bad really, but I may just clean that a little bit. But mostly I was concerned about this. Now I can move this thing freely, and that it'll actually have a lot more response idle-wise. If you get it, this thing is stuck, it's probably been sticking little by little as you've been driving your vehicle. You never known it. When you get back in it now, it's going to be a whole new different thing. It's going to idle a whole lot smoother and be more responsive. And also too, when you're decelerating like down a hill or something, you may notice not having to use the brakes as much, because sometimes it just gets fixed at a RPM. This thing is designed when it goes into coast mode to back this thing off completely, idle the motor down, and allow the vehicle to kind of like use the engine for braking. So anyway, so we've got this cleaned out. I'm gonna blow it out with an air hose a few more times, run a few more little bits of PB Blaster through here. Some will come out right here because this is the bleeder line for it. But anyway, so yeah, idle problem. And I'll get it back together and see what happens. Alrighty, here we go. We got it all back together. We'll start it up. Oops, so I get the key. Right. It's running smooth now. I'll never make a little noise. It actually has a little bit of an idle. Before it just idled one speed, it didn't start up and idle down. It just stayed at one speed the whole time. And then, like I say, it actually came in where it wasn't starting. It was flooded because it had closed off completely and jammed. It didn't open enough to start. So pulled that throttle body off and cleaned it real well in those ports that I had shown. And always use like some kind of oil to clean it. I wouldn't recommend brake cleaner in there. I use contact cleaner, a non-flammable contact cleaner in the mass airflow sensor, and I use a light air to blow through it to blow the dust off that's accumulated because of the air filter failure. New spark plugs and wires. So probably it needs a timing belt. That timing belt's in pretty bad shape, so I'm gonna have to tell him about that. But other than that, she's ready to roll. Thank you very much for tuning in. Starting and idle issues for this 97 Lexus ES 300 / Toyota Camry.